Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here for this session. My name is Bahar Saba, and I have the honor of moderating this panel. As you would see, we do not have Anahita right now because she just had a fantastic discussion, and it was quite back-to-back. So I believe that her session has been moved to the afternoon session now. But we have Fatma and Natalia. So we are going to conclude this session, I think, at around 1. So we'll have our speakers speaking for about 15 minutes each, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. I am going to introduce our speakers first, and then we'll get into our discussion. So our first speaker is Fatma Bulaz. Fatma graduated with a master's in Middle Eastern Studies from the University of Amsterdam, and she will be starting a second master degree in spirituality and religion at the same university. She's a curator and program maker of cultural programs. She was the program coordinator of the Freedom Book Fair and has collaborated on the 20th edition of the Arab Film Festival. And she works for the marketing and publicity department of Dancing on the Edge. And today, Fatma will be speaking about memorializing the 1988 prison massacre in Iran, during which the Iranian authorities extrajudicially executed thousands of political prisoners and dissidents. Our second speaker is Natalia Pashkeeva. Natalia has a PhD in history and civilization, and in her research, she focuses on NGO activities in the field of gathering, analyzing, and disseminating of information. She's a team member of the Offsite project, which aims to provide an archival ethnography of post-revolution in Iran, and we are going to learn about her work and the work of her team today. Natalia graduated from the Institute of History and Archives of the Russian State University of the Humanities in Moscow, and then completed a master's program on archives and digital humanities in Paris. So without further ado, I think we can go to our discussion. Fatma, please.
Hi, welcome everybody. I know a few faces from many years ago during another festival or conference. Welcome everybody. I think I want to take you a little bit in the process during my thesis that I actually finished recently in the end of June. And well, it's on a very heavy topic about the 1988 massacre. I think most of the people sitting here know about the massacre which happened in the 80s in Iran, just right after the Iranian Revolution. But for me, it was kind of interesting because during my master's, we focused on Iran, but not quite on Iran. It was more on the Arabic world. And since I've been traveling to Iran, like I've been there 5 times as a tourist, I learned kind of the language. So I kind of had this, I don't know, I really enjoyed going to Iran. But it never occurred to me that something like this happened in the 1980s. And it happened, I think, 2 years ago. It was an article in a small Turkish Armenian newspaper. And this newspaper, Agos, which was... it started with Hrant Dink, an Armenian journalist who was killed during daylight in front of his office in 2007. So this newspaper is basically a weekly paper which gives a voice to marginalized people. So think about the Kurds in Turkey, but also like Iranians like Mehdi Shabani living in Iran, who lost his own father during the massacre. He wrote a small article, a small piece about the 1988 massacre and writing about the mothers of Khaberan. So those are the mothers who have their name where actually several hundreds and thousands of maybe remains of the massacred dissidents are buried there. So this article about the mothers inspired me to write something because he made also the link with the Saturday mothers in Turkey. the Cumartesi anneleri, and the Saturday mothers. Since 1985, they are coming to this square in Istanbul, the Galatasaray Square next to the Lyceum. If you've been to Istanbul, you know this place. So they came every Saturday there, protesting for their loved ones who were actually disappeared. They were taken by the Turkish government secretly most of the time because of their socialist views on the one hand in the 80s, but also in the 1990s with like political activism. Think about the human rights of Kurdish people being violated, you know, also being activists on this point. So those people were like captured and they disappeared, and all of a sudden you would hear like, oh, my son or my brother is there, and they would not say, the government wouldn't say like we've killed them, but they would be laying on the ground. So these mothers were seeking for truth and justice. And you see really a comparison between the mothers of Khabaran, because they also seek for truth and justice. And coming back to my thesis, for the people who don't know about the massacre, so it seems like 1988, when you think of 1988, the first assumption which what we also learned during our study is actually the Iran-Iraq war, which is a massive I think you wrote your thesis on this. You can compare it maybe with the Second World War, but then in the Middle East. It was that devastating how many lives it took, young lives. And so during my studies, we talked about the state violence, and then looking to Iran and Iraq, how many casualties it had. But then like in the shadow, you had this, this massacre. And actually, the violence started already in 81. We can say that was like the first wave of violence, that a lot of people were captured and held in prisons most of the time. Very young people, even like we could say like children, were held simply for the fact like holding a pamphlet or being involved with any, I don't know, political organizations. And one of the most known, of course, is Mujahideen Khalq, or the People's Mujahideen. And whenever you also think all the time about 98 massacre, you always think about, okay, the Mujahideen, because like for 80 or 90% of those 5,000 people were massacred, they were people affiliated or linked with this political organization. That was also kind of interesting for me, but I didn't want to use their sources, because if you look at the Mujahideen nowadays, they have their own online let's say also like propaganda, like the Iranian state. I don't want to get all political, but I couldn't use these sources because they have a kind of a bias. Also, like the Iranian state has also a bias, because simply they say the massacre didn't happen, it never occurred. There hasn't been more than 5,000 people being massacred. On the other hand, you have like the Mujahideen saying 30,000 people are massacred. If you go most of the time to squares in The Hague, they protest a lot, and also in Amsterdam. So that was also a kind of, I knew about it, but I was like, 30,000, it sounds a lot, but if you go down to 1981, and the Iran Tribunal really did a great job on collecting these names, and there I found out in my thesis that there were, you could say like 15,000 people massacred. Again, still for the families, if it's a little number or a big number, it doesn't, it's still a big problem, because till today, those families, they don't have any justice. Sorry if I'm talking too fast, because I want to tell a lot of things, because at the moment you have, of course, the trial of Hamid Nouri, which I also wrote in my introduction. This is also kind of a way to expose the 1988 massacre. So it had like huge, I think, media attention in the world of journalism. Even in Dutch newspapers, you could read about this topic. And I think also recently with the Salman Rushdie attack, all of a sudden you could also read again in the newspaper the comparison with the other fatwa, which brings me to the fatwa, of course, of 1988, where Ayatollah Khomeini actually wrote a decree that those munafiq, the people who are like the enemies of God, should be massacred. So this secret fatwa all of a sudden comes again, you know, in the media. So, and yeah, when you talk about memorializing the 1988 massacre, for me it was interesting to find now information on the massacre, which was for me as a non-Persian speaker a little bit difficult. But thankfully, like Nasser Muhajir wrote a monogram on the 1988 massacre, which I would recommend you all to read, because it's like, for me, it was like my holy Bible. It had all the information I wanted on the massacre. And what I did was using the theory of memory studies and looking on the collective memory of this massacre. And when you look at collective memory, of course, the official memory, again, coming back to Iran, denying it, and also denying it because most of the people who were in those death commissions deciding which person would be massacred or not are still in high positions within Iran. So that's why also from Iran there is no critical voice, because all those people who have like blood on their hands are in those high positions. I'm talking now as an activist because since this panel is on it's based on human rights. Coming back to my thesis again, I also did kind of a comparison between, like, as I said, the Argentinian mothers of Plaza de Mayo and the Saturday mothers in Turkey. But what you see in Iran, and I didn't write it in my thesis because it's like kind of recently, is that, and this is my own theory, like once you didn't heal something which happened in the past, it kind of comes back in different forms. This brings me to like the mothers of Park Lale or mothers of Aban, like the activists in 2019 by Heart. You know, internet was shut off. People again were captured, and you didn't know where your child is taken. Is he alive or not? So it's like a pattern which comes back, and because of something in 1988, because that isn't like, it doesn't have like exposure, it has been denied, it can happen again. And yeah, this means that like also like internationally, it also needs more attention, maybe more pressure. I saw again, like they were collected again, there was a petition again on the 1988 massacre and sent again to the United Nations. But again, because we are at Iran Academia, also within Dutch universities or other universities, I think it's important to teach this topic, because to be honest, and I'm making slowly a bridge to the next part, because I also found about the offsite archive, but I couldn't use it yet because it's like, I think in the beginning phase, but I found it very interesting since like Iran is so close, that there will be an archive which I can use, because I had often the critique of my teachers, well, you're using Amnesty International as a source. It's not academic actually, but when you go and look sources on the 1988 massacre, it was actually Amnesty International and Justice for Iran who had actually the most interesting information for me and interesting data collected. So I had to actually use that because I didn't have other sources other than when you look at Iranian sources. One, I couldn't read it because it's in Persian. And secondly, when it came to English sources, I wanted to use like academics, and most of the time those were like Iranians who had been themselves a victim of human rights violations in Iran. So that was also kind of interesting, or a person who lost a family member during the 98 massacre, like Shohram Makaremi, who's actually, she also made a documentary Hitch, which also kind of which I use also in my teasers as a part of collective memory and this like how to remember the massacre. And I think she's done it very beautifully in your documentary, calling it like Hitch, this museum your father made out of this closet, like this. Yeah, you don't have anything of this person because, and there are also many theories on like sites of memory. This is like of Pierre Nora, like where a site becomes like a monument, and it's also like a memory of a certain thing happened in the past, like with the massacre of 1988, it is the cemetery, the Khaveran in Tehran, which becomes like physical a place of where these atrocities happened and where those thousands and hundreds of people are buried. So yeah, and what makes it interesting with the mothers of Khaveran is that this social movement kind of led to this Iran tribunal, and also the power of women, I think, motherhood or feminism, you name it, which you see also with the Saturday mothers, their resilience, you know, they are just moving. If you work for an NGO and, you know, you go home, you may take these stories, but with them, you know, it's their family and they really seek justice. So this comparison was also very interesting for me that I learned. But I also know that they tend to call themselves now, I think, the mothers and families of Khaveran, because it's not only the women or the grandmothers, but it's also like the brothers. And it goes like, yeah, the whole family is like seeking for justice and truth. Yeah, maybe I can also say this, the fact that the role of religion kind of also interested me, that I wanted to also delve more in it. That's why I chose to do a second master's in theology, because that was for me also very interesting, like how they use the religion, the Islam, to justify killing of those 5,000 people. I don't know if everybody knows how it went. It was basically like simple question like, are you Muslim or not? And then if you would answer like hesitantly, yes, they would ask you further. And that was just a reason to execute you in 1988. So that is also for me like interesting, like how the Islamists used also religion to justify their political crimes, their state violence actually. That was not where my thesis was about, but it's like for me like food for thought in the future. I don't know how many minutes because I talk a lot and I didn't look anyhow on my notes. I did it all by heart.
Thank you so much, Fatma.
Yeah.
I think we could hear Natalia and then get into some questions and hear a bit more about your work as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Bahar. Thank you, Fatma. Fatma. So I'm very glad also to be here today, and I want to thank a lot the organizers, and especially Reza Hasemi, with whom I was in contact, and who did a fantastic work of bringing together so wonderful and varied professional experiences. And also I want to express my good and thankful feeling to the anthropologist Hurrama Karimi, who is not here. She is a French anthropologist of Iranian origin, and she is the head of the Offsite Research Project based in the French National Research Center in Paris and funded by European Research Council. The project was conceptualized as an ethnography of post-revolution Iran, focused mainly on the first 10 years after 1979. And it is a pleasure that Chora suggested to me to come here to speak about this project. I'm a postdoctoral researcher in this project. We're a really small interdisciplinary team, and I will briefly present main problematic areas and also some key outputs. But when I saw the name of the panel, Human Rights, I thought that it will be really good for me also to stress a kind of a cause-effect relation that should exist between academic research and the broad and sometimes controversial field of human rights. Namely, the impact that social and human rights research, which I believe is a force, or should be a force, which identifies gaps and helps in fostering in kind of an inner emotional reference points for human rights to become really true self-evident. This concept, inner emotional reference points, was pointed out by historian Lynn Hunt. She wrote a fantastic work on the invention of human rights. And I think actually that it is about the need to formulate and to create and to spread certain interior shared feeling or deep-seated convictions about the rights in a community and about an equitable governance. This is also a way from me to align the engagement of the off-site research team in the field of human rights with the issue of archives like records, meaning information or data, registered on a variety medium and expressed in a variety of documentary forms like official governmental documents, private correspondence or official correspondence, official reports, also photos, audiovisual documentary films, and pieces of arts. My background is in history and archives, and I like to remind always some elements about specific features of archives and how we need to take them as historical sources. First, I like to think about archives or records as real products of our real lives, real processes or practices on which rely human activities, produced in continuity, always in continuity throughout the individual's lives or the activities of institutions or groups, as results of their functions and decisions performed or made naturally or organically. Organically, I mean following some logic functioning. Thus, initially, the act of creation of a record brings a kind of an intentional dimension and a plural nature of archives. One record is never independent. I mean, on the contrary, is always dependent on the whole body of archives of which he was part organically at the moment of creation. And so that data can be really used as evidence. This refers to the idea of archival integrity, which is actually very important. It refers to the context in which the archives have been created, or to the original context. And that is why, actually, because of this unintentional dimension and intrinsically plural nature of archives, that I like to use this word archives in plural. It's the old term of archival science, just like to remind always this plurality and an intentional, originally an intentional character of their creation. I want to consider the field of human rights in archives as a threefold, of course, with multiple color dimensions inside. First, archives as traces of the decisions which led to the violation of humanitarian norms and crimes, contrary to a sense of humanity. Second, archives as elements potentially useful for relieving knowledge or about the cases of violation and for achieving justice. Potentially useful. We can speak more about it later. Also, access to archives is a right in itself. Right to know, right to be informed, and also I would say this as a historian interested in Russian field by my origin and also in Iranian field thanks to Offside. Also the right to be aware about the past or understand the past as a real living process and not as a kind of a mess with multiple ideological imbrications in it. And of course, there are great implications for professional ethics. What kind of archival records were preserved and why? What is the degree of transparency about the creation of archives? What is the degree of transparency about the original content and actually the integrity, this whole body to which one record originally was part? All that I say seems to be really obvious, but I like my London colleague Yasmin. In such cases, she used to reply, obvious for whom? Yeah, maybe I will skip a little part because I wanted to speak about inspirations for the Offside project because in the field we never learn. But I will skip this to present briefly some concrete outlines of what we are doing actually, and then if we have time maybe we will return to the inspirations and so on. I want to mention first two big pieces of our work carried out especially by my colleagues. So of course we are working together, we are a team, but we have fields of responsibilities. It is first the chronology of the violence in the first 2 or 3 years after 1979. The work consists of really scrutinizing the Iranian press, like it a lot. I think, so this is carried out by my colleagues, and namely Yasmin, who is based in London. And I think she actually could add to her consideration the second one, but I'm not sure because it was really a huge, huge work. At the beginning, the idea was to provide really a chronology of violence based on the official press for the whole 10 years. And it was not possible to do because of the enormous volume of press, of data. So it is conducted by Yasmin, and it is a kind of an overview of chronology, or maybe an attempt to provide a more deep typology of acts of violence. She presented to us a really fantastic Excel table with multiple colors attributed to every type of an act of violence. The second very important part of our project is, I would say, to get in touch, first of all, and to create relations of confidence with people, families who experience the reality of violence and crimes in their own lives, like, for example, with the families who experienced the 1989 massacre. To get in touch, to create relations of confidence to be able to preserve the pieces of archives they have, and to transfer them, or mainly to digitize these pieces, and to transfer after the digital copies actually to the International Institute of Social Studies, but in Amsterdam. We are working in contact with their archivists. And this is a wonderful work which is done and sometimes really completely carried out by one of our good friend and colleague, Hamid Montazeri, who is a journalist in BBC. We could provide the same work for one little private archival collection of one intellectual and writer in France. And in the same way, we also could establish a very fantastic collaborative links with Amnesty International, thanks to Rahel Bahraini, who is present here. Our idea was also to provide more, not to give more visibility, because it's really difficult to give visibility to the physical archives related to so difficult topics, uncomfortable topics on which we're working on because of the sensitiveness of the data. But at least to provide more detailed classification of these archives for the future researcher will be able to get in touch with concretely in Amnesty International, and to try to work on these archives to get more data. And so finally, the third core element of SITE is a database called Account Archives of the post-revolution Iran, so always meaning the first decade. After 1979, this is actually my part of responsibility, and it is a kind of ethnography of actors involved in this period, actually active in the first 10 years after 1979, but also, of course, actors involved in the memorial politics or in the memory wars, I would say, in our days. So an ethnography of actors, but also an ethnography of resources, and resources physical and digital. I mean, physical archival collection accessible, of course, outside Iran, because we have no access to the collections inside Iran, and that is actually the reason for which the project is called Off-Site, because we are a team placed off-site of the main field of our research. So physical archives kept in archival repositories outside Iran, like International Institute of Social History or Hoover Archives, or, for example, less known repositories like a museum and library, La Contemporaine in Nanterre. And digital collections like Omid Memorial of Bormann Foundation, or digital collections created by Justice for Iran. And of course, and this is a great piece of analytical work, digital collections, web resources created by archival and research institutions inside the Islamic Republic of Iran. What we wanted to do is to provide a kind of mapping of practices, confronting them, and through this to show, to stress, to discuss another important point for academic research, which is the epistemological and methodological foundations of a research when you work on the field considered as a field at risk, difficult to access, dangerous to be accessed, for conduct an anthropological survey or to do a study in physical archives. And all this, of course, taken into considerations these issues of transparency as confronted to questions of ethics, and the famous state secrecy issue. A very big source of inspiration for me in this analytical work related to the digital action. So an analytical piece of work is these web resources built inside the Islamic Republic of Iran. They seem to bring online and put in open access a huge volume of digital copies of real archives. Several, you know them all, of course. And some examples are really fantastic from the archival science, archival theory perspectives. I think especially about the Center for Islamic Document Survey or the database of Institute for Iranian Contemporary Historical Studies of Mostazefan Foundation. They are really fantastic because you have an impression that they took real physical records from their repositories and they transferred them in digital environment. And this is a tricky thing because this digital thing replaced the original whole body. That is why I started my speech with some key elements of the archival science. So we decided that it's really important to bring these digital collections in line with some foundations of archival science, because we can many times debate it about construction of official narratives or construction of counter-narratives. They will say these are also ideologically constructed narratives. But when you have some concrete elements provided by practitioners and theoretical studies in archival science, you can provide some critical and really concrete for the debate. So we decided that it will be really interesting, and I will finish with this, the last point, that a great source of inspiration for me in this analytical work was a concept of agnotology suggested by Robert Proctor and Londa Shorbenjen. I don't think I pronounced correctly her name, some years ago. An agnotology as a study of ignorance, ignorance like an active construct and not a passive construct, not like a byproduct of some information activity. So I decided that it would be really interesting to put in line this analytical work with this conceptual thing. Maybe I will stop here.
Great.
And
thank you so much, Natalia. And it was great to get more of an insight into your project. So if that's okay, I'll kick off maybe with a couple of questions and then we can take some questions from the room. But I guess if you could kindly keep it on the shorter, briefer side so we can have the room ask questions as well. Fatma, I was interested in learning a little bit more about the comparative side of your research or what you came across it. I know that you worked on the mothers of Khavaran and how they have memorialized and mobilized from the early days in the face of state violence and repression and attempts to erase. And you made references to mothers in Turkey. And I would be interested in learning a bit more about the similarities in mechanisms and the manner in which they have mobilized in each country. In particular, that they have been probably different levels of repression at various stages. What you've come across that is similar or very different?
I think similar in state violence is that during the when Erdogan came in power in Turkey, he's now in power for like 20 years. At first, the Saturday mothers, they would go every Saturday on the square, but all of a sudden it kind of changed when Erdogan also started suppressing in like activists speaking out on the human rights of the Kurdish populations, for instance. And the state violence, I think if we make a comparison, I mean, Iran it is awful. Like once you are in Evin prison, you don't know when you will get out. In Turkey, it's not like that the mothers are like taken into custody. Well, that happened, but they would release. But what happens is like the space to express your freedom of expression, of mourning your loved ones, that becomes small, because all of a sudden at the Galata Square in Istanbul, it's not possible anymore for the mothers to come there, because you would have like the riot police standing there. So they are making it difficult for people going on the streets. And I think that is the comparison with Iran, that it becomes difficult for people to express their, how they think about maybe on what had happened in the past, and you want justice for that, and you would go on street with the picture of your loved one. There is no space for that. So at the beginning, Erdogan, that's the current president of Turkey, he talked with the mothers, and it was like, yeah, we will work on it. And it was like the first and the last meeting with the Saturday mothers was beginning of the 2000s. So I think that is the comparison, that there is no space to say what you want, and also to ask simply questions to the government, where is my loved one? And that's why all those missing people, the correct form to address them is actually enforced disappeared, or like people who are, they're disappeared. So you don't have the families don't have the bodies. So I think that is the comparison, that there in Iran and in Turkey it gets like worse, that human rights activists, but also academics, they have lesser freedom when it comes to critiquing the government for doing their jobs, what they have to do. Maybe that's a comparison, but again, the two countries are totally different, political-wise, of course. The lack of freedom differs in both countries, and you have like different degrees of freedom of expression. But in Turkey now, there is this Turkish singer who is now caught by the police for actually being like an LGBT activist, kind of. And I think media also plays a role in it. So also, when you say something online or somebody filmed it online, this can also be a reason in Turkey to be caught, simply because of, with that, you are kind of critiquing the ethics of the politics that is ruling now Turkey. And Turkey is also now ruled by a different form of Islamism, the party of Erdogan. I don't know if I gave an answer to you, but I think in a nutshell, the shrinking spaces of thinking freely and standing and asking for your rights and asking the government, tell me more, I want to know where my loved ones are. I think that is a comparison.
Thank you.
Although I want to say that the mothers, the Saturday mothers are talking about the people who are like missing in the beginning of the 1990s. So between 1990 and the top was like 1995, that people, socialists and Kurdish political activists were captured by the JITIM, like the secret police, and they were like lynched and killed. Yeah.
Thank you. Natalia, this might be a bit more based on my assumptions, but obviously archives are key for truth and justice, for the legal side and criminal investigation side of things. And I know that it's sort of the more early days of your work, but I was a bit more interested in learning about the patterns you might have discerned in looking into the practices of civil society outside of Iran. in their attitudes towards archives and the manner in which they have actually created records and archives. From the side of Iran, we know that there is lack of transparency, intentional attempt to erase and conceal and block access. But I'm interested again to know that from a community that's under attack and also responds to constant crisis in the country, how does that impact the way civil society in exile deals with archives?
So, well, it's really a good question. But actually, there are two things to be considered. First of all, if I speak about what is done inside the Islamic Republic of Iran, relatively to records, I mean archives, provided from that times, the period of first 10 years after 1979, and what actually they are concretely doing is it is to provide a really multiple and massive pieces. I called it massive pieces of the past, completely decontextualized and with no possibility to trace them. Because what is happening that you have real digital copies of real documents. So with this, and you have an impression that, okay, it's a real document. But actually the big problem is they are completely decontextualized, and you have no possibility to know this original context of their production. So, of course, we can say that, first of all, the civil society outside Iran do not simply do it. And it's a good thing. It's a simple and obvious thing, but it's a really good thing because of course, there are difficulties to access original records kept by families and or individuals who emigrated Iran. But that is why I spoke about this idea to build, first of all, relations of confidence with these families, because once you have these relations, you can access these archives, or the relations of confidence with the international NGO like Amnesty International. Once you have them, you can access not only multiple isolated pieces of and decontextualized pieces of the past, but the whole body, and it changed completely the thing. The second element to be considered is the production of memories and testimonies, because, for example, the oral history project built by an oral history seminar in Tehran, and there is a huge web resource available online, a database of testimonies. It's also interesting because what you have is always the transcripts of some testimonies provided, like real transcripts of real testimony provided by people whom you don't know, and provided by people in reply to who show some concrete elements important for the construction of official narrative. For example, I have recently read one testimony about Mustafa Chamran. So you ask yourself, why Mustafa Chamran? Because so we understand that Mustafa Chamran is something really important figure for the post-revolution period in the ideological discourse. But you ask yourself why this people is concretely, you have a number of multiple people who are focusing on this person, and you understand that they did it concretely for this ideological reason. What I have when I'm working on, for example, a mid-memorial database, which is a database with records about biographies of people who was victims. So first of all, it's the question of transparency. Actually, with the mid-memorial, I have no problem. I know who produces it. You have information about these people accessible. You have a big piece of transparency about it. And it's really actually important. You can debate about who was right and who was wrong, but transparency is a really important element in this digital environment. I refer myself to the famous expression, transparency is a new objectivity in the digital environment. It's an expression coined by several people, but like, you know, with concepts. Sometimes you do not know who was the first to bring this concept to the public. So this is a concept, an idea expressed in the 1990s when the digital environment has to be they started to construct actively digital environment. So this is really important. And returning, for example, to Amid Memorial is completely different practices. They do not really pretend to maybe to provide complete transcript. They focus only on the biography. They have their own archives, so you can access these archives one more time if you build a confidential relationship. So it's different.
Thank you. So I think we can, we have 5 minutes. So can we then get some questions if anyone has questions? Yes, Kiara.
First of all, thank you so much for all your explanations. I have a question for Fatma. Article 23 of Iran's constitution states that investigation of individuals' beliefs is forbidden. But we know all that it's not true at all, like many other things. And you also briefly mentioned something about the role of Iranian regime's theology in the 1988 massacre. So actually they are investigating everyone's beliefs. In that regard, there are also lots of legalized discriminations in the civil code of Iran that religious minorities especially are facing, from employment to marriage, to inheritance, to even adopting a child, and many other points. And that makes them, I believe, double vulnerable. So I would like to hear your opinion in this regard, and have you done any research in this area or not? Thank you.
Yeah, very briefly, I didn't do research, but what I know is like there is kind of a solidarity among when it comes to minorities, because when you look at the Mothers of Khaveran, the reason that they found out this place had to do with the Baha'i cemetery, which was next to it. And the Baha'is is also a group that is being persecuted in Iran simply for their faith, for their belief, and it's not recognized by the Islamic Republic of Iran. I haven't done research, but I know that there has been done a lot of research on, I don't know if you were specifically mentioning that as minorities, but the first thing that popped up in my mind are the Baha'is in Iran who face persecution. And there is this kind of a solidarity with the Baha'is because they are also being persecuted. And I think they were also the first one at the beginning of the 1980s who were idam, who were executed because of their faith. I don't know if I kind of gave you an answer on that point. Yeah, that's the only thing. What I know it's about the cemeteries, because their bodies are also like considered like dirty by the Islamists, so they have to be as far as possible from the Muslims section of the cemetery, and also like the hypocrites, because they called the people who were massacred in the 1980s. They were also considered, their bodies were dirty, and it should be as far as possible from the Muslim cemetery. Just a small thing, because I think Iran does a good thing when it comes to collective memory of the victims of the Iran-Iraq war. All of a sudden, they know how to keep this memory alive. So for me, there was also kind of a very huge contradiction between how they memorialize the victims of the war, of the 8-year war with Iraq, and then when you look at the victims who were actually, in my opinion, the revolutionaries for the Iranian revolution, all of a sudden these are hidden. So for me, that was also kind of very interesting, the difference between like those are like the heroes and those are like the enemies of Islam and enemies of the Islamic Republic of Iran. So you can make a lot of comparisons, like all of a sudden Iran knows how to keep this memory alive. This,
Shahla Talebi, I think, has written an interesting essay article on that, if anyone is interested to read on the comparison. So we do not, unfortunately, have time for any more questions.
Thank you very, very much for both your very interesting stories about archiving. I don't know if it has come to your thought, or did you see that also a few years ago, the Baha'is have put up an archive on Baha'i persecution, and it's these stories and these archives were meticulously collected and finally put into on the web and in Persian and in English. And I also know, I don't know if you came across stories like that Iran is not so willing to, when something happens, to give it let's say, a form in paper. Okay, we are persecuting you now, we are taking your house, or we are doing this or that. So it's really hard to collect any evidence. There's this story, this personal story, but it's really hard to collect evidence, because the Iranians are really good in hiding this, but just doing that, or even to make videos and all kinds of things which are really fake, but that's then what is on national television. And as you were mentioning, there's no, the spaces are shrinking, and especially for this group, but probably also others, there's no space even to talk about this. So, but I think it's really important for human rights to have these archives, and to make them available as much as possible. So thank you for all your work. It's really good. It's not really a question, but just
thank you for your comment. Thank you. Thank you so much, Fatma and Natalia. You did mention that there is, well, these issues, the mass violence that has characterized the past decades, it's part of our heritage, is impacting generations, but it is academically understudied. So it's really great to hear more about theses and projects that are focusing on that. Thank you so much for a wonderful discussion. Thank you.